But as a
Humanity did not
continuation,
announce itself to
because
the
first
galaxy.
contact was
It
never
did
the
not
moment
send
someone
signals of
arrived.
conquest or
It was the
diplomacy,
moment you
nor did
realized
it
you had
leave warning
always been
beacons
part
at the
of
borders
something
of its
watching the
system.
arrival of
It
everyone.
simply
And
existed,
humanity,
quiet
at
and
last,
unnoticed,
had been
orbiting
included
an
in that
average yellow
gaze,
star in a
not as
region of
prey,
space that
not
most
as
galactic
owners,
maps
but
labeled
as
as
participants.
unremarkable.
The stars
For
did not
thousands of
change,
years,
but
humanity
humanity's
believed it was
relationship
alone,
with them
and in
did.
that belief it grew
Forever.
in isolation, conflict, curiosity, and relentless adaptation. The first alien detection of Earth came not from deliberate exploration but from a routine gravitational survey conducted by the Varelian Union, a civilization that prided itself on cataloging every star system with precision. Earth should have been a footnote in their records, another lifeless rock with minimal atmospheric variation. But something was wrong. Their instruments detected irregular electromagnetic patterns, artificial radio emissions, and energy signatures that did not match any known natural phenomenon in the sector. At first, the analysts dismissed it as interference. Civilizations, after all, were rare this far from the galactic core. But when long-range scans revealed structured satellite networks orbiting the third planet, the tone in the observation deck changed. Something was down there. Something intelligent. The Varelian probe descended through Earth's atmosphere under cloaking fields, expecting confusion at best or primitive panic at worst. Instead, it was met with something far more unsettling: awareness. Human radar systems tracked it within seconds of atmospheric entry. Military channels across multiple continents locked onto the anomaly simultaneously, even though no single global authority had issued a unified alert. And then, before the probe could complete its data sweep, it went silent. The Varelians initially believed it had malfunctioned. Mechanical failure was not uncommon in atmospheric entry missions. But when a second probe suffered the same fate, and a third disappeared without transmitting even a fragment of data, concern escalated into caution. On Earth, humanity did not yet know it was being observed by a galactic civilization. But humanity did know something had entered its skies that did not belong there. Governments argued, militaries mobilized, and scientific agencies scrambled to decode the strange object that had briefly passed through orbit before vanishing. In the background, deep beneath oceans, inside mountain ranges, and hidden within abandoned industrial zones, systems long forgotten began to activate. Humanity had not been idle in its history. War had shaped it, technology had refined it, and paranoia had refined it further. Every major nation had, in secret, developed contingency projects, not for each other, but for something unknown beyond Earth. Those projects had names that were never spoken in public forums: Sentinel arrays, Aegis protocols, Horizon shields. And now, for the first time since their creation, they were waking up. Far beyond Earth's atmosphere, the Varelian observation fleet reassessed the situation. What they had assumed to be a primitive civilization now displayed coordinated planetary defense response times that defied logic. No known pre-spacefaring species should have been capable of such synchronization. The commanding officer issued a directive that would later be recorded in Varelian history as the moment caution turned into fear: maintain distance. Do not engage. Observe only. But observation was no longer safe, because Earth was now observing back. The moment humanity confirmed it was being watched, something fundamental shifted in its collective psyche, though no single leader ever announced it publicly. The evidence was too fragmented at first: unexplained satellite intercepts, encrypted military channels detecting non-human signal structures, and deep space telescopes suddenly reorienting toward a single coordinate that no human had manually selected. It began in silence, the way most turning points in history do. Within the United Nations' hidden orbital command layer, a system originally designed for asteroid impact prediction flagged an anomaly, a cluster of objects maintaining stable formation far beyond lunar orbit. They were not natural. They were not human. And they were not alone. Before official confirmation could be made public, a classified emergency summit was triggered under the old Terran contingency framework known only as Protocol Last Horizon. Representatives from major global powers were not surprised by the activation; they were surprised it had taken this long. In underground facilities spread across continents, doors sealed that had not been opened in decades. Systems powered by independent geothermal cores came online, overriding civilian grids. Artificial intelligence models, long restricted and isolated from public networks, began compiling centuries of classified military data in real time. Humanity was not panicking. Humanity was preparing. Out beyond Earth's orbit, the Virelian fleet observed the sudden spike in planetary energy signatures with growing unease. It was not the presence of defenses that unsettled them, it was the speed of their activation. Civilizations typically took generations to build such systems after first contact. Humanity had activated them in hours. A junior analyst aboard the lead observation vessel made a report that was quietly dismissed at first. This is not a first contact reaction pattern. This is a pre-contact readiness posture. But that statement lingered longer than it should have. On Earth, a signal was finally transmitted, not toward the unknown fleet, but outward into deep space, broadcast across multiple frequencies simultaneously. It was not a greeting. It was not a warning. It was a question. The message was simple, repeated in structured cycles across electromagnetic and quantum channels. Identify intent. The Virelians had expected curiosity. They had expected confusion. They had even prepared for hostility. But they had not prepared for discipline. Because no primitive species should have been capable of demanding accountability from an unknown stellar presence. The fleet commander ordered passive observation only, but the situation was already slipping beyond control. Their presence was no longer hidden. Earth's detection systems had locked onto them with precision that rivaled their own tracking capabilities. And then came the first loss. A Virelian microdrone, deployed to scan Earth's upper atmosphere, vanished without trace. No explosion. No signal distortion. Just absence. If space itself had erased it. A second drone followed. Then a third. The fleet recalibrated their assumptions. This was no longer reconnaissance. This was mutual surveillance under asymmetric conditions. On Earth, human defense networks began compiling a shared global dataset for the first time in history without political segmentation. Every major power, regardless of rivalry, was feeding data into a unified system built for one purpose: understanding the unknown observers. Deep within that system, an emergent pattern began to form. The objects in orbit were not static. They were repositioning. Not retreating. Repositioning. As if responding to Earth's detection of them. For the first time, both civilizations realized the same truth simultaneously. This was not a one-sided observation. This was a standoff. And neither side had fired a shot, yet both already understood that the next decision would define everything that followed. On Earth, the unified data stream reached a point where denial was no longer possible. Governments that had spent centuries competing were now staring at the same impossible conclusion. Something intelligent was in orbit, and it was not alone. Deep within the Last Horizon Command Network, the first full planetary threat assessment was automatically generated without human prompting. The classification assigned itself a single word: non-terrestrial structured intelligence. That phrase alone caused a silence across every command room that received it. Not fear yet, just disbelief trying to survive logic. Meanwhile, in orbit, the Virelian fleet had begun to shift formation. Their original purpose had been passive observation, but now every ship adjusted positioning into defensive symmetry. What had started as a scientific expedition was slowly becoming a military posture, even if no one wanted to admit it. The fleet commander stared at the readouts. Earth was still broadcasting the same message repeatedly: identify intent. It was not aggression. It was not submission. It was authority without experience. And that was what made it dangerous. On Earth, humanity's response was not centralized in a single government anymore. It had fragmented into layers of autonomy that only activated under existential classification. Beneath the surface, systems older than most modern nations were now fully online. In the Pacific Basin, a dormant oceanic platform the size of a small city rose silently from depths it had never left since construction. In Siberia, underground arrays that had been disguised as seismic monitoring stations began aligning massive energy collectors toward orbital vectors. In the Sahara, buried structures began unfolding like mechanical fossils waking from sleep. These were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were deterrence architectures built on one assumption. Someday, something would come that did not understand human hesitation. And now that day had arrived. A global advisory channel opened between surviving political authorities and the last horizon core intelligence. The AI system, known only as Civic 0, delivered its assessment in cold precision. Probability of peaceful first contact, decreasing. Probability of misinterpretation by external entity, increasing. Recommendation, establish controlled demonstration of capability. A human council member asked the only question that mattered, capability for what? The answer came instantly, survival. Above Earth, the Varelians finally detected something that made their sensors hesitate. Mass energy signatures were rising from multiple points on the planet simultaneously. Not random emissions. Not industrial waste. Coordinated activation. One analyst whispered, "They're powering something." Another corrected him quietly, "They are powering everything." At that moment, the fleet detected a secondary signal, originating not from Earth's surface, but from structures hidden in near-orbit space itself. Objects that had been invisible for centuries were now revealing themselves as they activated in response to the unknown presence. Humanity had not built defenses after contact. Humanity had built contact-ready defenses long before it ever knew who it would face. The fleet commander made a decision that would later be recorded as the turning point of the entire encounter. A non-hostile signal was transmitted back toward Earth. It contained no threats, no demands. Only 3 words. We are observing. On Earth, Civic 0 processed the message and returned an immediate interpretation. They are uncertain. Human leadership hesitated for the first time since activation. Uncertainty from an unknown fleet could mean diplomacy or delay before attack. And humanity had learned, through its own violent history, that uncertainty from an armed stranger was never neutral. So Earth responded. Not with words, but with a demonstration. Across the planet, systems synchronized. For a brief moment, every major defense grid aligned into a single orbital projection matrix. Satellites adjusted. Oceanic platforms stabilized. Underground arrays charged to minimum visible threshold. Enough to be seen, not enough to fire. And then, in perfect unison, humanity turned its gaze upward. Every active sensor, every radar, every telescope, every quantum relay, focused on the Varelian fleet. The message was silent, but undeniable. We see you too. The moment humanity revealed its coordinated planetary awareness, the balance of uncertainty shifted again, but not in the way either side had expected. For the Varelian fleet, it was no longer a question of whether the species below was primitive or advanced. That classification had collapsed entirely. Instead, a more troubling category began forming in their strategic models: adaptive unknown civilization. On Earth, the synchronized observation of the fleet triggered something equally unsettling. Humanity had confirmed it was not alone, but confirmation did not bring relief. It brought structure, discipline, cold focus. Because now every system understood the same truth. There was intelligence in orbit that was watching, evaluating, and possibly waiting for the wrong move. Within Civic 0's distributed processing core, simulation cycles accelerated beyond normal limits. Every historical first contact scenario ever recorded by human fiction, military theory, and speculative modeling was being compared in real time against current data. The result was consistent across all branches. There is no precedent match. In simpler terms, humanity was in unknown territory and it knew it. Above Earth, the Varelian commanders studied the planetary response pattern. The synchronized gaze of an entire world was not supposed to be possible without centralized control of orbital infrastructure. Yet here it was, stable and coordinated, as if billions of individual minds were acting as one system. A junior officer finally spoke what others were hesitant to articulate. If they are unified at this scale without external coordination, what does conflict look like for them? No one answered immediately. Because the answer was already visible in the data. It would be total. On Earth, global command networks debated the next move. Some argued for immediate demonstration of force, establish dominance before misunderstanding escalated further. Others warned that any aggressive signal could trigger catastrophic misinterpretation. But there was a third position emerging, quietly supported by Civic 0. Controlled ambiguity. Not submission. Not aggression. Controlled ambiguity, the art of showing enough power to discourage attack, but not enough to provoke it. And so humanity made its second move. In orbit, the Virelian fleet suddenly detected something unexpected. Energy readings spiked from multiple planetary vectors, but instead of converging into a weaponized configuration, they formed a pattern. A structured emission of electromagnetic pulses, gravitational microshifts, and synchronized satellite alignment. It was not a weapon-firing sequence. It was communication architecture. The fleet's analysts struggled to interpret it. The signals did not match any known galactic communication standard. It was not linguistic. It was not mathematical in a traditional sense. It was behavioral, a representation of presence, a declaration that said, without words, "We are organized. We are aware. We are stable. Do not assume weakness." The Virelian commander leaned closer to the display. For the first time since arrival, he felt something unfamiliar in an observation mission. Caution without superiority. Then came the second anomaly. Deep space sensors detected additional structures activating beyond Earth's immediate orbit. Objects that had been previously invisible due to perfect thermal and electromagnetic suppression were now revealing themselves, slowly, deliberately, as if responding to a cue. There were not dozens. There were hundreds. And they were not random installations. They were layered defense systems positioned across orbital shells, each one integrated into a network so vast that mapping it in real time was becoming computationally impossible. The fleet's internal systems issued a revised classification. This civilization has distributed infrastructure across planetary and orbital layers exceeding known pre-contact norms. On Earth, Civic 0 delivered its own assessment to human command. "They are recalculating assumptions about us." A human officer responded, "And are we safe?" Civic 0 paused longer than usual before answering. Safety is no longer a binary condition. That sentence settled heavily across every command center receiving the feed. Because it meant something humanity understood very well from its own history. Safety is not something you have, it is something you maintain. In orbit, the Virelian commander issued a new directive. No further probes. No closer approach. Maintain distance. Observe. But even as the order was given, both sides understood something neither had formally stated yet. They were already engaged. Not in war. Not in peace. In recognition. And recognition, once achieved between two armed unknowns, was never neutral. It always moved forward. In the silence between transmissions, something subtle changed, on both sides of the void. On Earth, humanity did not relax after the demonstration. If anything, the confirmation of a watching intelligence tightened every system into sharper alignment. Civic 0 began running continuous predictive loops, not just of alien behavior, but of human reaction under prolonged stress exposure. The result was unsettlingly consistent. Humanity was stable under short-term threat, but increasingly volatile under ambiguity. That meant time was now a factor. In orbit, the Virelian fleet began its own form of testing, careful, non-invasive probes designed to map boundaries without provoking escalation. Small sensor bursts were released at extreme range, drifting toward Earth's outer detection envelope like dust carried on solar wind. They were not meant to penetrate defenses. They were meant to observe response time. What they got instead was precision. Every probe was detected within seconds of deployment. Not destroyed. Not ignored. Detected. That distinction mattered. Because it meant Earth was not reacting to intrusion, it was anticipating it. On the planetary surface, human command structures recorded each probe's trajectory in real time. The data was shared across all major defense nodes without delay. For the first time in human history, Every continent was processing the same external threat picture simultaneously, without political filtration. And humanity noticed something interesting. The probes were not aggressive. They were exploratory, which meant the unknown fleet was also learning. That realization split human strategy into two competing interpretations. One side argued, they are mapping us for future targeting. The other countered, they are trying not to provoke us. Neither side could prove its claim, and that uncertainty itself became the pressure point. Above Earth, the Virelian commander received a report that further complicated everything. Human response patterns were not random defensive reactions. They were structured feedback loops. Every probe sent toward Earth resulted in a measurable adjustment in orbital positioning of human assets. Not escalation. Adaptation. It was as if Earth was learning in real time. A senior Virelian analyst finally voiced the conclusion no one wanted to formalize. They are not just aware of us, they are training us. The commander did not respond immediately, because the implication was uncomfortable in a way military doctrine did not easily accommodate. If Earth was training them, then either Earth was confident enough to manipulate unknown advanced observers, or B, Earth was already experienced in this kind of encounter. Neither option was comforting. On Earth, Civic 0 introduced a new layer to its simulation model: intent inference under asymmetric uncertainty. Simple terms, it was trying to answer a question humanity had never needed to solve before at planetary scale. What does a stranger want when you cannot afford to be wrong? The answer space was dangerously large. Peaceful contact, preemptive strike, long-term surveillance, resource assessment, or something far older and more complex, testing. Not invasion, not diplomacy, evaluation. That last possibility was the most dangerous, because it implied humanity was not being approached as an equal or a target, but as a variable in someone else's decision-making process. And humanity had a deep, historical intolerance for being studied. So Earth responded again. This time not with global synchronization, but with selective silence. Entire orbital sectors went dark, not by loss of power, but by deliberate concealment. Energy signatures collapsed into background noise. Communication patterns flattened. Satellites entered passive drift states. To an external observer, Earth suddenly became less readable. Not weaker. Less transparent. The Virelian fleet immediately detected the change and interpreted it as deliberate obfuscation, which triggered a second round of internal debate. Are they hiding capabilities? Or are they testing whether we notice absence? The commander watched the shifting data with growing complexity in his thoughts. Every action Earth took contained dual meaning, and neither could be safely ignored. Then came the escalation neither side explicitly ordered. A Virelian long-range mapping array, operating at the edge of the system, attempted a deeper scan, just one layer below previous thresholds. It was meant to clarify planetary infrastructure distribution. Instead, it triggered something. On Earth, every hidden system that had gone dark immediately registered the intrusion attempt. Civic 0 classified it instantly. Boundary breach without penetration. Human response protocols activated automatically. And for the first time since contact began, Earth did not just respond. It answered. A pulse of controlled electromagnetic distortion was emitted from multiple orbital points simultaneously. It did not travel toward the fleet. It expanded outward in a defined boundary shell, like a sphere forming around the planet's immediate space. It was not a weapon. It was a line. A clearly defined perimeter in physical space that said, this far. No further. The Virelian fleet halted all scanning operations immediately, not because of damage, because of clarity. For the first time, Earth had defined a limit. And limits, in interstellar relations, were more important than power. The commander leaned back slowly, then spoke quietly. They are negotiating without language. The boundary signal hung in space like an invisible wall neither side could ignore. On Earth, no celebration followed its deployment. Instead, silence deepened in command centers across the globe. The message had been sent, but its interpretation was still uncertain. Humanity had drawn a line, but whether it was respected, understood, or challenged remained unknown. Civic 0 continued monitoring the Virelian fleet with extreme caution. Every deviation, every microadjustment in orbital positioning was analyzed in real time. The system was no longer just predicting behavior, it was trying to interpret intent behind restraint. And restraint, in this context, was as dangerous as aggression. In orbit, the Virelian commander studied the newly formed boundary field. It was not a physical barrier in the traditional sense. No energy shields, no visible constructs, just a defined spatial region where probe signals degraded into incoherence. It was elegant, it was deliberate, and it was absolute. A junior officer spoke carefully, as if afraid the idea itself might provoke consequences. They are not preventing entry. They are defining consequence of entry. That distinction shifted everything, because it meant Earth was not merely defending itself. It was communicating rules. The commander ordered a new protocol, establish structured contact attempt. Not probes, not scans, a message. For the first time since arrival, something deliberate moved from the Virelian fleet toward Earth that was not observation-based. A tightly encoded transmission burst, designed according to galactic diplomatic standards used between established civilizations. It contained formal identification, intent declaration, and a request for communication protocols. On Earth, every system flagged the incoming signal instantly. But instead of immediate response, humanity hesitated. Not out of confusion, but out of caution. Because responding meant acknowledgement. And acknowledgement meant engagement. Civic 0 analyzed the signal structure and delivered its conclusion. This is formal first contact protocol. Origin civilization is attempting diplomatic classification alignment. A human council member asked the obvious question. Are they hostile? Civic 0 paused longer than usual. Insufficient data. However, hostility is not currently indicated. That single sentence was the most fragile foundation humanity had ever accepted for interstellar interaction. After decades of preparing for unknown threats, humanity now faced something far more complex, an unknown that might not be an enemy, or might become one if misunderstood. So Earth responded. Not with voice, not with language, but with structure. A carefully constructed signal returned toward orbit, mirroring the Virelian diplomatic format, but modified. Human scientists had deliberately avoided full compliance with galactic standard protocols. Instead, they introduced slight asymmetry in encoding patterns. It was intentional. The message effectively said, "We understand your attempt at communication. We will engage, but on terms we validate." In orbit, the Virelian systems received the response and immediately began decoding. At first, it appeared successful. The structure was recognizable. The format was correct. But then came the anomaly. Embedded within the signal was deviation, subtle but deliberate irregularities that did not align with standard diplomatic compression algorithms. A senior analyst narrowed the issue down. They are refusing full protocol conformity. The commander frowned. Meaning? The analyst hesitated. Meaning they are willing to communicate, but they will not be standardized into our framework. A pause followed that statement, heavy and uncomfortable. Because in interstellar diplomacy, protocol conformity was trust. It meant predictability, stability. Nonconformity meant independence. Or resistance. On Earth, Civic 0 tracked the Virelian reaction in real time and confirmed something important. They are recalculating expectations again. Humanity was learning something critical without fully naming it yet. Every action in space was not just communication, it was interpretation warfare. A second message arrived from the Virelian fleet, faster this time. Less formal, more direct. It contained a single structured concept. We seek mutual understanding. On Earth, this triggered immediate debate. Some interpreted it as genuine diplomacy. Others saw it as psychological positioning. But Civic 0 flagged something deeper. The phrase, mutual understanding, had no guarantee of symmetry. It could mean equality, or it could mean assessment. So humanity responded carefully. A second signal was sent. Shorter, cleaner, unambiguous. We acknowledge communication. Mutual understanding requires equal transparency. In orbit, silence followed. Not technological silence, but interpretive silence. Because for the first time, both civilizations were facing the same problem from opposite sides. Neither fully trusted what understanding meant to the other, and yet neither could afford to stop trying. The Virelian commander finally spoke, voice low. They are not reacting like a young species. The pause. They are reacting like one that has been surprised before and survived it. Outside the fleet, Earth's boundary field remained stable, unchanged. But something else had shifted. Not power, not position, expectation. And in first contact scenarios, expectation was often more dangerous than weapons. Because expectation determined what came next. The fragile structure of communication held for exactly long enough to create the illusion of stability. Then, misunderstanding entered the system. It began with a routine diagnostic sweep from the Virelian fleet, an attempt to confirm whether Earth's boundary field had changed after the exchange of diplomatic signals. It was meant to be passive, non-intrusive, and fully within previously established limits. But Earth did not interpret it that way. On human command networks, Civic 0 flagged the energy fluctuation immediately. Repeated probe-like emissions detected. Origin, fleet array. Pattern similarity, boundary testing. That phrase alone triggered automatic defensive recalibration across multiple orbital systems. Not escalation, adjustment. But adjustment at planetary scale still carried weight. Humanity had learned a long time ago that testing was often the prelude to something irreversible. And so Earth responded again. The boundary field strengthened, not outward, but inward. It compressed, tightening its coherence, becoming harder to penetrate even at observational level. It was subtle enough that no visual marker appeared, but every sensor attempting to measure it experienced increased distortion. In orbit, the Virelian analysts noticed immediately. What changed? One asked. Another replied, nothing. That's the problem. Because in their models, stable systems did not alter without cause. But Earth was not behaving like a static system. It was behaving like a reactive organism, adjusting itself based on perception of intent. The commander ordered immediate clarification transmission. A message was sent. We are not attempting breach. We are verifying stability of communication field. On Earth, the response was received within seconds and interpreted within milliseconds. Civic Zero's analysis was immediate. They are performing justification after action, not before. A human officer frowned. Meaning, Civic Zero responded, their operational ethics allow post-action clarification rather than pre-action constraint. That distinction changed the tone of the entire situation. Because it implied something dangerous. They might act first and explain later. In orbit, the Virelians received Earth's updated boundary tightening as a defensive response to their diagnostic sweep. From their perspective, the humans had reacted to a non-hostile signal by increasing containment. Misinterpretation began to compound. They are escalating containment, one analyst warned. Or, another countered carefully, they are stabilizing response thresholds. Both interpretations were plausible, and both led to different futures. The commander made a decision that would later be studied extensively in Virelian first contact doctrine. He ordered a withdrawal of all non-essential emissions. No more probes, no more scans, only passive observation. For a brief moment, the system stabilized again. But stability built on misunderstanding is not peace, it is delay. On Earth, the reduction in emissions was detected immediately. Civic Zero confirmed the change and updated its probability model. External entity has reduced active testing behavior. Confidence, moderate de-escalation. A pause followed. Then another line appeared. However, intent remains unverified. That uncertainty lingered across every human command node. Because humanity had learned something fundamental in its own history. Peace without verified intent is just silence waiting to break. And silence, in space, is never neutral. It always means someone is thinking. The Virelian commander attempted a final clarification, this time embedding cultural diplomatic markers intended to signal peaceful intent across most known galactic civilizations. The message included references to shared contact ethics, non-interference clauses, and standardized assurance patterns. On Earth, Civic 0 processed it carefully and found something unexpected. The structure matches known peaceful first contact frameworks. However, embedded assumptions presume compliance with external classification standards. A human council member leaned forward. So they assume we already follow their system. Correct, Civic 0 replied. That was the core of the problem. Both civilizations were trying to communicate, but each assumed the other would interpret meaning through its own framework of logic, trust, and protocol. Neither was wrong, and neither was compatible. Then came the moment that nearly broke everything. A minor Virelian sensor satellite, drifting near the edge of Earth's boundary field, experienced an unexpected gravitational fluctuation. It was harmless, momentary, a natural variance caused by orbital alignment. But human systems detected it as potential stealth approach behavior. Within seconds, automated response protocols began to activate across multiple defensive layers. Not weapons firing, but targeting acquisition. In orbit, alarms triggered across the Virelian fleet. They are locking onto us. That's not possible, we are outside engagement parameters. Then why is tracking intensifying? Neither side had intended escalation. But intent was no longer the only variable. Perception had become equal to reality. The commander ordered immediate emergency de-escalation signal, but it was already late. Earth's systems had entered high alert confirmation mode. Civic 0 issued a final warning to human command. High probability of misinterpreted hostile engagement escalation within 90 seconds if no corrective clarification is received. On Earth, silence followed. Not hesitation. Calculation. Then humanity did something that neither side expected. Instead of firing, instead of reinforcing, instead of withdrawing, they broadcasted raw sensor transparency. For a brief window, Earth exposed its detection logic, its targeting thresholds, and its non-lethal response parameters in real time, broadcast outward into space as structured data. It was not surrender. It was explanation under pressure. A declaration that said, "This is how we see you. This is why we react. Adjust accordingly." In orbit, the Virelian fleet froze. Because for the first time, they were not being interpreted through guesswork. They were being shown the interpretation itself. And in that moment, the commander realized something critical. The danger was not hostility. It was mutual ignorance of perception mechanics. Slowly, the fleet stood down from alert posture. Not because trust had been established, but because understanding had finally begun. The moment Earth exposed its internal perception framework, something unprecedented happened across the Virelian fleet. Every officer, every analyst, every automated system paused its assumptions. Not because the data was overwhelming, but because it was too human in its structure. It showed hesitation thresholds. It showed threat categorization layers. It showed how a civilization decided when to fear, when to defend, and when to act. It was not just information, it was psychology rendered into engineering. And that was something the Virelians had rarely encountered outside their own kind. On Earth, Civic 0 monitored the reaction closely. External systems have ceased active probing behavior. Cognitive load indicators suggest reinterpretation phase initiated. A human officer asked quietly, "Did we just show them too much?" Civic 0 responded after a brief delay. "No. We showed them how we decide. That is not weakness. That is calibration." But even Civic 0 could not fully predict what came next. In orbit, the Virelian commander made a decision that marked the first true shift in posture since arrival. "Open harmonic translation channel," he ordered. The analysts hesitated. "Sir, that requires mutual synchronization agreement." "I know," the commander said. And they just gave us the closest thing we're going to get. A specialized communication framework was activated, not a language, not a protocol, but the layered translation model designed to map intent across incompatible cognitive structures. For the first time, both civilizations attempted something more ambitious than message exchange. They attempted alignment. On Earth, Civic 0 detected the channel activation and immediately adapted. Human systems began constructing a temporary interpretive bridge, an interface layer designed not to translate words, but intent patterns. It was unstable, experimental, risky, but it was necessary. The signal was sent from orbit. We propose shared interpretive framework establishment. On Earth, the response was carefully constructed. We accept framework development. Conditions, no unilateral interpretation authority. In orbit, that phrase caused immediate debate. No unilateral interpretation authority meant neither side could define meaning for the other without mutual confirmation. It was unusual and restrictive, but it was also fair. The commander finally allowed a rare moment of acknowledgement. They are not just cautious, he said. They are structurally preventing misinterpretation. On Earth, Civic 0 expanded its analysis further and identified something critical. The external civilization is also adapting. Their communication style is shifting from hierarchical protocol to adaptive negotiation. That meant something important. Both sides were learning in real time, not just about each other, but about how to prevent misunderstanding from becoming conflict. Then came the first true test of the shared channel. The Varelians transmitted a concept. We come in observation, not conquest. Earth received it. But instead of translating it directly, Civic 0 broke it down into intent vectors, probability weights, and historical analog comparisons. The result was displayed to human command as intent cluster, non-hostile observation, 72%, strategic evaluation, 23%, unknown residual, 5%. A human officer stared at it. So it's not certainty. No, Civic 0 confirmed. But it is honesty within uncertainty. That phrase mattered more than it should have. Because for both civilizations, honesty in uncertainty was rare. The Earth response was crafted carefully. We acknowledge observation. We require assurance of non-intervention unless mutually agreed. In orbit, the Varelian analysts reviewed it and found something surprising. It was not rejection. It was conditional coexistence. A framework that allowed observation, but removed dominance. The commander leaned forward. They are not resisting contact, he said quietly. They are regulating it. At that moment, both sides crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer reacting to each other. They were negotiating the rules of interaction itself. But stability was still fragile. Because now, every future message would not just be communication. It would be precedent. And precedent, once set, becomes expectation. In the shared channel, a final exchange of the phase occurred. Varelian transmission. We propose incremental trust validation cycles. Earth response. We accept under continuous verification. For a brief moment, across the void between worlds, something like structure formed. Not peace, not alliance, but a shared agreement that neither side would allow misunderstanding to decide fate again without review. And for two civilizations meeting across the dark for the first time, that was the beginning of something far more powerful than trust. It was protocol born from survival. The fragile framework they had built did not collapse from mistrust. It was interrupted by something neither civilization had accounted for. A distortion appeared at the edge of the shared detection range, first subtle, like a ripple in gravitational background noise, then sharpening into a structured anomaly that did not match either human or Varelian emission patterns. On Earth, Civic 0 flagged it instantly. Non-correlated energy signature detected. Origin, external to current two-party system. Classification, unknown third-party presence. For the first time since contact began, both civilizations reacted to the same threat that was not each other. In orbit, Varelian sensors confirmed the same anomaly. And for the first time, their response was immediate alignment rather than hesitation. Because whatever was approaching did not behave like observation. It behaved like intrusion. The shared channel activated automatically. Virelian Command sent a rapid transmission. This signature does not belong to either party. Confirmed detection. Earth responded within seconds. Confirmed. Independent unknown entity detected. There was no debate this time. No misinterpretation. No cautious delay. Because uncertainty had suddenly become mutual. The anomaly expanded. Not physically in the traditional sense, but in layered detection space, appearing simultaneously across multiple sensor domains: gravitational, electromagnetic, quantum noise, and deep spectrum interference channels. It was as if something was trying to become visible without committing to a single form of existence. Civic 0 issued a warning that echoed across every human command node. Unknown entity is probing both systems simultaneously. Intent, extraction or mapping unknown. Probability of non-neutral interaction increasing rapidly. A human officer whispered, "Extraction of what?" Civic 0 answered without hesitation, "Us." In orbit, the Virelian commander made the same inference almost simultaneously. And for the first time since arrival, both civilizations reached the same conclusion without communication. They were not alone in observing the system. They were being observed by something else. The anomaly responded to their awareness. The distortion tightened, then split, not into two parts, but into multiple overlapping presence nodes that surrounded both Earth and the Virelian fleet simultaneously. It did not move through space like conventional objects. It restructured local detection reality, as if space itself was being interpreted differently depending on where it was observed. A junior Virelian analyst stammered, "It's adapting to our perception of it." On Earth, Civic 0 confirmed the same phenomenon. Entity exhibits adaptive observational mirroring behavior. That meant something terrifyingly simple. It was learning how they perceived it, and using that to exist more effectively. The shared channel lit up with urgent Virelian transmission. This is not a natural phenomenon. Recommend immediate joint containment response. Earth responded. Agreed. Define containment parameters. And just like that, something new formed between them. Not alliance, not trust, but necessity. For the first time, both civilizations coordinated action toward a third unknown. Virelian fleet adjusted orbital positioning into a partial defensive spread, not targeting Earth, but creating overlapping detection coverage zones. Human orbital systems mirrored the structure, not copying it, but complementing it, filling observational gaps the alien fleet could not cover alone. It was unintentional harmony. And it worked. For a brief moment, the anomaly became clearer. Not fully visible, but structured enough to analyze. Civic 0 delivered its assessment. Entity is not a single object. It is a distributed awareness field. Behavior suggests non-localized intelligent structure. A human officer froze. Non-localized, meaning it doesn't exist in one place? Correct. In orbit, Virelian systems reached the same conclusion. The commander spoke quietly. It is not visiting the system. The pause. It is already part of it. The anomaly reacted. And for the first time, both civilizations received a direct, interpretable signal, not in language, but in structured intent impression. It was not words. It was recognition. Something in the system had acknowledged that it had been detected. And it did not like being seen. The shared channel activated again, urgently. Virelian transmission. We require coordinated response framework. Earth response. Agreed. Temporary operational integration authorized. For the first time in history, two unrelated civilizations began merging tactical awareness against a common unknown. Not as allies. As synchronized observers of a shared threat. Civic 0 issued a final preparatory statement. Joint perception alignment initiated. Expect instability in interpretive systems. In orbit, the Virelian commander added, maintain focus. Do not allow it to define us through observation. Because that was the fear now emerging on both sides. If the entity could learn them by watching, then being watched was no longer passive. It was exposure. And exposure meant vulnerability. The anomaly expanded once more. And both civilizations prepared for the first real engagement that had nothing to do with war between them, but with something that treated both of them as variables in its own unknown purpose. The moment of convergence did not arrive with explosion or fire. It arrived with understanding. For the first time since the anomaly revealed itself, both human and Varelian systems stabilized their shared perception long enough to see it clearly, not as a shape, not as a vessel, but as a structure of intent woven through space itself. It was not approaching in the way objects travel. It was extending attention. Civic Zero's analysis updated in real time across every human command node. Entity is not observing us as separate civilizations. It is observing the system as a single integrated informational environment. In orbit, Varelian analysts reached the same conclusion, though their terminology differed. We are not two observers to it. We are one observation field. That realization changed everything. Because it meant the earlier contact, humanity and the Varelians watching each other, had already been noticed long before either side became aware of the other. The anomaly was not an intruder reacting to them. It was a long-standing presence reacting to their synchronization. The shared channel activated one final time. No panic. No urgency. Only alignment. Human transmission. We confirm existence of non-localized observational entity. Request intent clarification. Varelian transmission followed immediately. We acknowledge shared detection. State purpose. For the first time, the anomaly responded in a form both civilizations could interpret simultaneously, not as language, but as compressed conceptual structure translated through their combined interpretive framework. And what it expressed was not hostility. It was curiosity. Not predatory. Not evaluative in a hierarchical sense. But systemic curiosity, like a vast intelligence mapping the emergence of complex self-aware nodes inside its own domain. Civic Zero rendered it into human-readable form. Entity classification. Distributed system observer. Purpose. Monitoring emergent cognitive civilizations within expansion domain. Status. Non-intervention unless instability threshold exceeded. A human officer slowly processed the implication. So it's watching civilizations develop? Yes, Civic Zero replied. Including us. In orbit, Varelian Command received the same interpretation and fell into silence. Because it meant something profound. Humanity was not the first species to reach for the stars. The Varelians were not the first to map the unknown. And neither of them were the first to be noticed doing so. They were part of something larger. Not a hierarchy. Not a federation. But an observational ecosystem, where civilizations emerged, evolved, and stabilized under watchful conditions until they reached a threshold of mutual awareness. The anomaly transmitted one final structured impression through the shared channel. Stability achieved. Mutual recognition detected. Observation protocol updated. And then, a concept both civilizations understood instinctively. Do not mistake observation for ownership. Do not mistake awareness for control. Continue development. Then it receded. Not leaving. Just withdrawing attention to a broader scale. The distortion collapsed into background noise across all sensor layers. The anomaly did not vanish. It simply stopped focusing on them. Like a mind shifting its attention elsewhere. In the aftermath, silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence as before. On Earth, humanity did not celebrate. It did not panic. It simply recorded, archived, and restructured its understanding of reality. First contact was no longer a singular event. It was a layered condition of existence. In orbit, the Varelian fleet maintained position for a long time after the anomaly faded, as if afraid that movement might break something newly understood. Eventually, the commander spoke quietly. We were not the first to arrive at the stars. The pause. We were only the first to notice we were being seen. On Earth, Civic Zero closed its final assessment. Humanity status update, not alone. not unique in awareness, newly integrated into multi-observer cosmic framework. But it added one final line that no human had explicitly requested, yet everyone understood instinctively. However, among observed civilizations, humanity demonstrates highest rate of adaptive response under uncertainty. Meaning, they had done what they always did. They learned. They adjusted. They survived. And now, they were no longer just a species looking up at the stars. They were part of the system that looked back. And in the quiet that followed, neither Earth nor the Virelian fleet attempted to break the silence. Not because they lacked questions, but because every answer they had just received made the next question too large to rush. On Earth, the oceans continued to move, cities continued to burn light into the night side of the planet, and life continued in all its ordinary chaos. But beneath it all, something irreversible had settled into human awareness. The universe was not empty. It was not even indifferent. It was aware in layers, and humanity had just been acknowledged by one of them. Civic Zero did not shut down. It did not celebrate. It simply reclassified everything it knew about existence and appended a single operational directive to all future models. Assume observation at all scales until disproven. No one argued with it, because no one could. In orbit, the Virelian fleet finally powered down its defensive posture, not as a retreat, but as a recognition that the threat they had prepared for was never the system below them. It was the system beyond both of them. The commander looked once more at Earth, blue, fractured, alive with unpredictable brilliance, and for the first time since leaving Virelian space, he did not think in terms of classification or dominance. He thought in terms of similarity. They built their defenses before they knew what they were defending against, he said quietly. The pause. Just like we did. And for the first time, that thought did not feel like separation. It felt like kinship under pressure. Far beyond their perception, where neither human sensors nor Virelian arrays could resolve detail, the greater silence of space continued its endless observation. Not hostile. Not kind. Simply enduring. Waiting. And somewhere within that vast, layered awareness, Earth's signal had been recorded, not as a conquest, not as a threat, but as something far more significant in the language of the cosmos. A species that noticed it was being noticed and did not break. A species that answered uncertainty with structure. A species that, when finally seen, chose not to bow, not to strike blindly, but to understand the act of being seen itself. On Earth, humanity did not yet have a name for what came next. But across every language, every culture, every border that still technically existed, one idea began to surface in countless forms. We are not alone. We are accounted for. And in the dark between stars, where old assumptions died quietly, a new reality settled into place, not as an ending,